Amazing, everybody. Well, we are all so excited to have you today. Sarah and myself, and even other people on our team, we've been going back and forth a long time. Motion, Varos, making it come to life. And then we had to bring the amazing Max to talk all about how creative strategy became the cornerstone of our paid advertising. So everybody, you're in for a treat today. I'm excited to have everyone here. So what I first wanted to do before we start getting into the meat and potatoes of what will be happening today is, of course, we're going to get to how creative strategy became the cornerstone of paid advertising. But I just wanted to say a quick couple words just around the Motion side, and then Sarah's going to be able to jump in on the Vero side. So Motion, for those who aren't in the loop, we are the home for creative strategy, which means the analytics and reporting behind everything that's going on. And the reason that we exist is because creative has become the #1 lever for success in all of your paid advertising. But what we also know is that there's a couple different types of people involved. We have our data heads, our media buyers, everyone who lives in spreadsheets. Whereas on the other end, we have our creative team members who are exactly that, creative and conceptual. So both of these teams need to be like this, but they're ultimately like this. So where Motion comes to play is we really want to help bridge that gap with creative strategy. So what that means, and we'll get into some of this later, but what that means is we make it super easy for you to be able to analyze what's going on, visualize that in a really effective way, and ultimately share it with all of the number of people who are involved in the process. So that's a big reason why I'm excited to be talking to Max today about why creative strategy is so important in the grand scheme of things. But I'm gonna toss it over to Sarah now to talk about Varos a bit.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah, head of marketing at Varos. So just to give you a quick overview about what we do. So Varos is a platform that provides real-time benchmarks for both marketing and revenue KPIs. So your metrics like CAC, your retention, click-through rate, conversion rate, return on ad spend, all of that good stuff, to actually show you how you compare to your competitors. So typically as marketers, we only have access to our own historical data, which leaves you in some ways flying blind and not understanding if shifts in your metrics are due to overall market changes or if it's actually the work that you're doing. So Varos lets you see how you actually stack up against your competitors and dig into those specific underperforming metrics. So we're a data co-op. All of our data actually comes directly from our clients. And right now we have over 4,500 companies and 5 billion in ad spend being tracked on the platform. We integrate with most major platforms. So your Facebook ads, TikTok ads, Google ads, GA4, more always being added. We just recently launched the first solution for actually benchmarking your video ad performance on Facebook. And for our agency folks, we have an agency version as well if you're looking to actually manage multiple brands within the platform. So that's a little bit about what we do, but yeah, excited to get into the topics for today.
So important, benchmarking, know how you sit in your vertical, in your industry, all of that to make the story come to life. So excited that we get to partner on this one. Everybody, some housekeeping bits before we go into everything. First things first, questions. If you have any questions, please throw them into the Q&A tab. So that's in the top right. And what you'll notice is you'll be able to upvote anything that you might be interested in. The second thing I'll note, and I saw one question come through already, is recording. The recording will definitely be made available after the call, so everyone's going to access it. And then the final thing I'll note, I'll throw a couple links in a second, is that on the Motion side of things, we have the Creative Strategy Summit coming up. So if you want to learn even more, come check us out. And we're always hiring. So we have some roles. If you're interested, hit me up. Got your back. Make it come to life. Cool. All right, everyone. Now is when we get to it. The man, the myth, the legend, Max. Welcome to the building. We are so excited. We are so excited to have him. Sarah and I have known Max for a little while now, and someone we deeply respect. Director of Partnerships over at Grow. If I can speak anymore, Coast Digital. And for himself, he's been in the game for a while now, but for the past 7 years, been absolutely crushing it on the performance marketing side of things. And he's had the pleasure of collaborating with clients such as Barstool Sports, SiriusXM, and the Caller Daddy podcast. So we got some logos up there that are really impactful. So everybody in the chat, can we please show some love to Max and welcome him to what we have going on here?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I love it. So where I wanted to kick us off, everybody, is just centering our conversation around what's really going to be going down today. So at Motion, we talk a lot about the creative strategy flywheel, and we're of course going to talk about what creative strategy and why it's so important here. But basically, what we wanted to kick off with here is starting to get into just like the basics of where do we even start in this entire process. So anyone who's been to a previous event of ours knows how important research is in determining who you're going after and the pain points that you're going to tackle. So Max, I'm wondering if we can introduce people with a real soft lob before we get into all of the details of creative strategy. Is when it comes to your research, where do you go to gather information and start to build out your personas?
Yeah, it's a great question. And for us, at Coast, we consider ourselves a creative first performance agency. So everything that's built in our strategy is meant to drive performance, but that research is what actually goes into driving the results that we're ultimately after. And we kind of separate that during our process between qualitative and quantitative sort of research for our creative strategies. So on the qualitative side, I mean, if an account has previous data, we're looking at all previous data. We're looking at that for specific creative variables to see what's been tested, what hasn't, what moved the needle the most, what hadn't moved the needle very well, just to make sure that we're getting ahead of some tests maybe early on that don't need to be run. So we're utilizing the data to really give us a head start. But then on the qualitative side, it's all about understanding the industry and obviously understanding what performs well from a visual perspective, from an aesthetic perspective. So Evan, I mean, it's exactly to your point of like merging those two sides of the brain, one being the data driven, one being more so that like historical creative mindset that's more so visually driven. So all of our research is really rooted in those two things, and that's what informs for our clients our first kind of 90-day creative strategy.
Awesome.
Yeah, that sounds great.
And so with that, after you go through the process of collecting sort of your initial research, where does typically this information live after collection, or kind of how does that come to life?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously we're on the data side of things. We're heavily utilizing both Motion and Varos to really pull out that data. On the Motion side, obviously we can link that directly to those ad accounts. So the Meta account, the TikTok account, to really figure out from like a thumb stop rate perspective, hold rate, click through rate, etc. Again, like where that performance has been, or maybe where that performance has been soft for a particular brand. So that's like a super helpful like baselining exercise for us. And then obviously that lives within the Motion dashboard that we link to our brand's ad accounts. And then we also create customized like Looker studios so that we can have all of our data in one place between all the different platforms that we're utilizing to drive performance. And then on the Varos side, I guess from the data perspective, what we really love about that platform is it's really helping us establish what an actionable metric for success looks like, right? So it's one thing, and you'll hear this all the time in e-commerce, it's like, hey, we just want ROAS to improve. We just want click-through rate to improve. And improve is typically like the goal. And we argue that like improving is not a goal. Like we want to have a very specific goal that we're shooting for. And we found that Varos is a super helpful tool to help us do that. That, thumb stop rate should be specifically 25% or above as maybe an example rather than just better.
Yeah.
Full picture is so helpful. Full picture is so helpful on that front. Sorry to cut you off, Sarah. I think something that like kind of just jumps out to me now is you've started through your qualitative and quantitative, and this has gone to live somewhere. Just to jump back to the qualitative and quantitative side of things, I'm almost wondering if you have like a checklist in mind that you can give to the folks who are listening in, where it's just like, hey, when I'm saying quantitative, this is the first place you can kind of start to trickle through. Versus the qualitative, these are the areas you can dive into. And then maybe we can talk about how to put a bow on that on top of it. But hoping, you know if that makes sense or if that's possible.
Yeah, absolutely possible. And I think the best way that I can maybe present how we look at it would be to share a little bit of like what it looks like when we do actually present these findings to so at the end of the day, a lot for us is rooted in, and I believe I'm sharing my screen here. Again, So what you'll see pop up on the screen here is some of our initial Varos analysis that we bring into our creative strategy conversation. So this is obviously rooted on the quantitative side. So we're looking at performance metrics, obviously here. So, CPP or CPA, ROAS, CPM, click-through rate, cost per click, etc. So really diving into that, the performance metrics that can kind of tell the story of, again, why something's successful or why it's not, or what aspects of something are successful or why it's not. And again, a very helpful platform to do that. And then where we transition that is if we see something soft or something strong, Varos then also provides some of these benchmarks in terms of hook rate, hold rates for 50 and 75% through plays, average watch time, and then obviously click-through rate. So this gives us that more tactical approach of, let's say if we see in the previous screenshot that our cost per click is maybe high. How do we get that down, and how do we further analyze that? Is we can look through then our video metrics. So if our hook rate's really low, that could lead to a very high cost per click. So that's one of the examples of how to use this as a baseline. And then obviously Motion provides us all of that data for the existing creative that's within the account, which kind of gives us that baseline. And that's the quantitative side of things. The qualitative side is really understanding the vast amount of variables that can go into creative testing and prioritizing those. So for us, we have a list of not all, but a lot of the variables. It would be probably the full presentation if it was all of the variables. But some core things we're looking at as it informs creative strategy is what product is your hero product? What flexibility do we have with that in terms of offers? What format are we presenting that in? Is that a video, a motion graphic, static? There's framework is a very popular, I'd say, buzzword within creative strategy. So what framework are we operating off of, and on and on and on? And then those variables help to kind of inform the qualitative side. So if we know something works well for a competitor, what does that look like? What does that feel like? What does that sound like? So that we can, again, get as close to something that we know is going to work without just having to throw a bunch of random ads at the wall and spend money to figure that out, right? We're very much rooted in the strategy side, and obviously so are Motion and Varos, which is why we love them, because we believe that you can probably get 80% of the way there with a thorough and thoughtful strategy, rather than just the volume-based approach of testing a bunch of ads and spending money to figure out what works.
Love it. And then the final interjection I have, and I'll throw it back to Sarah for sure, sorry for rudely cutting off, is now this makes a ton of sense. Conducting the qualitative, quantitative, marrying it together with the exact method you would talk about is super helpful. Now, when we're talking about putting a bow on it, what I really mean there is this information is then translated to different audiences. We have, in your case, the clients on one side, it's the creative team, whether it be internal or external on that side, and it might be other stakeholders who are involved, whether it's client or creative side or in agency side. So on your end, are you always using decks to tell this story so everyone's on board? Or what does the process look like depending on who the audience is?
Yeah. So, I mean, from our perspective, one of the things we really seek to do, and I think this is true of an external partner like us, or even an internal creative team, some of the hardest or one of the hardest things to gain is alignment, right? With that creative strategy and with the why behind it, right? There's a lot of, I'd say, internal battles within creative that can steer a brand one way or another. One of them, for example, is being heavily brand focused versus being fully performance focused is sometimes those things are at odds. So for us, the way that we present this, the way that we kind of wrap a bow around it is very visual, and it tries to provide as many examples as possible. And one tool that we've found that is really helpful for us in order to do this is a platform called Milanote, which is a real-time kind of living, breathing, web-based platform that we use for all of our creative strategies. It's actually a screenshot of that on the screen as it stands. But to give maybe like a better example, is like diving right into this is like, for us, again, we're always looking at what can we do now, but also what can we do into the future. We do think it's super important to be able to have a why for like what happens in the next 30 days, but also what happens in the next 60, 90 days, etc. So this is an example from one of our brands that we work with that highlights what concepts are we doing in the next 30 days, as we head into month 2, as we head into month 3. And you can see each of these assets is then really presented in a way that highlights what product, what framework, what value prop, what's our copy. We'll add scripts to this as we go so that we're aligned throughout the entirety of the relationship. And I'd say, from our process perspective, or if you're an internal creative, this document and this platform has been wildly helpful to like source that feedback quickly to gain alignment to move forward. Because I think we can all agree, like, especially with creative, delays are like the death sentence of a creative testing process, right? So like that's, I think, a really helpful tool to like help speed that up.
Cool. Awesome. And yeah, I saw Evan shared a link to Milanote in the chat if anyone was interested in checking that out. Cool. So I know we sort of started to dive into some of these next questions just around, crafting the actual offer and plan for a client, but just how do you start to, take all of the research that you've compiled and then start to actually put that together into an offer or a proposal for one of your clients?
So I think that, as far as like creating an offer, and I'll take this as if we're like creating an offer on behalf of the client to be launched in the performance like campaigns that we're launching. And that's very client specific. Again, it can very much go back to some of those battles, like the brand versus performance, side of things. Some brands have no issues taking their hero product and like using that as a way to gain, traction and engagement from like a buy one, get one off, like certain buy one, get one free, or get a certain percentage off, or some like gift with purchase or something of that nature. And we do see those to drive great like performance results from a performance perspective or an advertising perspective. So again, very much dependent on the brand and the client, but oftentimes you can find a lot of insight into what's going to resonate from an offer within the community of that brand. So this kind of goes back to like the qualitative sense of like what can drive a great creative strategy. One of our clients comes to mind that has an amazing online community, super active, super engaged. It's a Facebook group. They granted us access to that. We're in there. We're like living, breathing alongside like their very passionate brand advocates. And frankly, like that language, the things that they value from that brand is the best thing that you could use to help inform the offer, because that is authentic. And rather than just saying like, oh, I get something for free, it's more so I'm getting something that's valuable. And that's the key to a good offer is really value. And sometimes that's a free product, but oftentimes it's more of like, I'd say a deeper, more like emotional response to that.
And Max, have you noticed there be any like best practices that you run into with the types of clients that you run that you run ads for and run multiple things for?
Best practices in terms of offers, I would say, again, leading with the hero product is like far and away like the best jumping off point, right? Like if you already have something that has a lot of consumer like trust and validation in terms of reviews and things of that nature, like that's always going to be the best jumping off point. It's very hard to build an offer with something that hasn't been adopted yet by at least some subset of consumers. So, I mean, that would be the jumping off point. And then, I mean, for us as like a performance partner, it just comes down to margins, right? So like, we're always trying to work to understand where the flexibility is and like what's actually going to move the needle from a revenue perspective. So I do think like considering your margins is obviously a big part of that as well.
Most definitely. Most definitely. Okay. So we've come to the point where we've built out or collected a lot of information on what the pain points are, both qualitative and quantitative. We've crafted an offer. Now what we're here to talk about is that 90-day plan. So we've alluded to it a bunch, but on your end, when you're starting to craft out that 90-day creative roadmap, where do you begin and how does that evolve?
Yeah. I mean, for us, again, this 90-day roadmap was all rooted in ensuring that all stakeholders know why we're producing what we're producing. So that's like the root cause of like why this is impactful. And again, it's impactful for us, but I would guarantee you this same process would be very impactful for like any internal team as well. But as far as like, I guess where we start, again, we've kind of gone through like the qualitative and quantitative research that fuels that. So I won't, kind of repeat that, but then layering on that offer and then ensuring that the ad types and the frameworks that you're choosing speak to that and speak to that at a specific part of the funnel, I think is also another thing to consider. Like offers are typically going to be more of like a bottom funnel sort of production. So you need to consider like where you're at with your brand if you want to focus on that bottom funnel versus like more so top of funnel brand awareness sort of content. But again, that's the whole purpose of the 90-day roadmap, is to ensure that each and every decision is understood and communicated clearly so that we have that alignment. And the reason we do it on a 90-day basis is, one, so that there's always an understanding of what the creative testing approach is. Again, there's any number, thousands, hundreds of thousands of variables when you like look at it of like what could inform your creative testing strategy. The 90-day roadmap's about prioritization. It's about understanding what's going to make the biggest difference for that brand's goals soon, 30 days, in the midterm, 60 days, and then heading into the future for the 90 days. So I'm not sure if that directly answers your question, but is that somewhat in line?
Yeah, it helps. I think the only follow-up I have there is like around flexibility. So what I'm curious about is when you are crafting that 90-day plan, month one is tomorrow, right? Like you start and you're trickling through the first 30 days,
Yep.
But then day 60 and day 90 are a little bit farther down the path. So how prescriptive is the 90-day roadmap versus how like flexible or a mesh between the two does it start to look like?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the way that we look at the 90-day roadmap is this really represents, again, those core testing like variables that we need to kind of like check off our list in order to say this either works for us or it doesn't. So I would look at the 90-day roadmap as breadth, right? So again, there's thousands of variables. Hopefully the data and the analysis and the research gets us 80% through any sort of like wasted tests that like just won't perform right off the bat. We're going to then get the rest of the way 20% through testing that subset that still exists within the roadmap. But Evan, exactly to your point, this is dynamic, right? So like, it's not enough to say, cool, here's your assets this month. Talk to you next month. Like that's not going to drive performance. So again, the roadmap is there for structure. One of the processes that is super important to performance for us is iteration. And that happens on a continuous basis just within our performance marketing. So iteration provides you that depth on a particular framework or asset. And that's where like really monitoring those creative metrics comes in. Because for each asset utilizing something like Motion, we can track the thumb stop rate, hold rate, click-through rate, and really understand not only did that asset work, but what pieces of it worked, and could it be combined with another high-performing piece of maybe an alternate asset to, I always use the term like to Frankenstein together an optimal asset. So like that's a big part. Yeah, exactly. It's alive at the end of the day. But that's a huge part that happens on a continuous basis. So that's like the sprints. The roadmap's more of the map, I suppose.
Awesome. And yeah, I think something, always a super interesting discussion people are probably curious about, but when you're starting out and you're designing this creative roadmap, how does your team approach deciding on the media mix for a certain client?
It definitely depends on the size of the brand, where they're at in their growth story, and what they've done historically. I'd say are like the three kind of core like inputs to that. And I'll try to speak to each one. So I'll start with like what the brand has done historically. Obviously, if there's data to dive into, that's like a no-brainer for any internal employee or external partner like us to start with, right? And again, the beauty of platforms that can plug in and like give you that extra level of granularity that like hasn't existed specifically on Meta in a couple of years, of like really what's moving the needle, rather than just some of the high level metrics that you're left with within that platform now, is, I think, a huge advantage for anybody is really being able to kind of fill in that gray area for performance. But I guess get back to the root of your question there, Sarah. Obviously, anything you've done in the past should be able to be done more efficiently with better data. So let's start with optimization. Then it comes down to the goals of that company and like where they're at in their life stage, which then helps to determine what additional or complementary platforms might make sense. So we always like to start on the core platforms, Facebook, Instagram, so Meta, and then Google, YouTube, really on the search side, and then layer on additional or complementary platforms once we have proof of concept and proof of efficiency there. So then that would look like layering on TikTok or layering on Microsoft ads from there. So that's more or less the progression. We still see a ton of value in making sure you nail those legacy platforms first, rather than like kind of chasing, I guess, the shiny object. So that, like shiny object, that might be more of a short-term, less sustainable strategy.
Okay, awesome. And how do you strategize around the actual budgeting?
Yeah, again, very, very dependent on some of those same factors. But as far as the budgets go, and this is probably like no secret to anyone who's running specifically on like paid social, you'll probably hear a lot of people talk about going broad and letting the algorithm and the machine learning do a lot of the work in terms of budget optimization within the campaigns. Sometimes that is at war with like creative testing, right? So for example, if you're operating on a slim budget and you really want to figure out what assets are working the best, throwing multiple assets into like an advantage shopping plus campaign on Meta might not be your best choice, because Meta's going to choose, right? And you're not really going to get a straight test across those. Now, Meta typically chooses pretty well. Like that's known to be true. So from a performance perspective, that might be your best choice. But from an insights perspective, you're only really learning one thing. That works better than that, according to Meta. So there are ways that you can run individual campaigns, just put one asset into it, force budget to that to gain those insights. And really, you probably sacrifice some efficiency, but you learn more. And this is, again, where it comes back to understanding the budget and like really what you're capable of doing as a brand. Are obviously larger brands can test all of these individual assets because they have discretionary budget to do so. If the main goal is efficiency, I would recommend staying within like best practice and really letting the algorithm or the platform choose for you, and then really put your effort into analyzing, I guess, on the back end, what's working rather than upfront.
Super interesting. Like, I think when you talk about the core platform, starting there before optimizing and scaling is a very like interesting approach, especially rooted in data and knowing what works. The only follow-up I have on there is just related to the creative side of things. So when you are starting out on the core platforms and you're going through the creative roadmap process and then building creative, is there a specific approach that you'll deploy across all platforms? Is it specific to each channel? What does that or how does it evolve the roadmap essentially?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and I'm sure that everyone here understands that it's very hard to repopulate meta creative to something like TikTok, right? So it's one of those things where, again, depending on where you're at as a brand, and if leveraging one of those complementary platforms like TikTok is a main goal, it's really important to know that you're going to need a dedicated creative budget for that. And that can look like a lot of things. I mean, that can look like sourcing great UGC or like testimonial style content in that format. It can look like, leveraging an external partner to produce some of that. You can produce that in-house. Like, the great thing about TikTok is it doesn't have to be expensive. It just has to be authentic. So like that is one of the key things to consider when picking your platform. Again, one of the reasons we start with what we consider the core platforms, the legacy platforms, is that because you're able to be a little bit more salesy, for lack of a better term, in terms of communicating with your customer because they expect that on something like Instagram, you can really learn more about your entire funnel. So you can really learn more about what's generating engagement through like the click-through rates, through the thumb stop rates. You can learn what's driving action through the click-through rate. You can learn what offer works the best because you're actually able to present it on those platforms. So I would definitely say TikTok is the platform where you're definitely going to need to dedicate some time to figuring out an additional content strategy to drive value.
Gotcha. And we've put all of this work basically into a roadmap that's coming to life and evolving over time. Now we're at a place where it's actually gone down. So what I'm curious about is just on your end, how do you typically assess what's working and not, and what type of decisions are you making from what you see?
Yeah. So as far as how we're analyzing this internally with our team, Motion, again, is a wonderful platform because it's linked to your ad account. That data is happening in real time on an asset by asset basis. You couple that with having a great benchmark that we can shoot for by leveraging Varos. And that's how we know, based on that real time data, is it working or is it not? For us, things that aren't working, we're not going to keep pushing budget to it. So like those are weekly decisions that we're making. If it's not working, it's off. If it is working, it's on. And we're going to obviously continue to leverage that asset. But also like what that means is within that asset, what specifically is working. So then that's what we're more so analyzing on a monthly basis, where we're saying, great, this was our top performing asset this month. Now let's look at it very granularly and compare all of that to all of our other winning assets across the board to see where we're winning each individual battle of thumb stop rate, hold rates, click-through rates, to see if there is room for iteration or improvement. Then those learnings get sent back to our creative team to iterate on for the next month. So then that's how we're generating those kind of like tests within the test to kind of improve performance moving forward. As far as like the overarching roadmap, again, it's a 90-day roadmap. So obviously it's complete after 90 days. For us, that's the start of the next quarter. We're going to do the whole process again, right? So then that's where we really zoom out and say, based on the work this past quarter, much bigger data set, like what did we learn? What do we need to test moving forward? What are those new variables maybe that we haven't tested that still represent like a new opportunity for us? And then that's how we inform that next cycle of this.
And just to clarify, when you say working, what does that start to trickle down into in terms of metrics to determine if it's working or not?
Yeah, at the end of the day, we love creative because our clients love performance. Yeah, so it's one of those things where and we love it for other reasons too, but that is I think the root of it is we call ourselves a creative first performance partner for a reason. At the end of the day, we know creative is that main lever to inform or impact performance. So at the end of the day, the brands we're working with are evaluating us on kind of like your standard historical e-com metrics. Like at the end of the day, ROAS, CPA decreases, like all of that is still fair game for them to say, like, what's going on here, or great job here. So that's I think, to our brands and to any brand, probably what's most important. For us, all those other metrics lead to that. So for us, it's really understanding like the gray area that leads to the performance. But I'd say how we know if something's working is it's driving revenue or a decreased customer acquisition cost for our clients.
And just a follow-up question there. So those times where clients are sort of digging into metrics, which of course inevitably happens, and like you said, sometimes it all ends up coming down to that, and they can still, ask you questions in terms of what's going on here. So how do you handle that, just in terms of your reporting back to clients, and how do you kind of field those types of questions when they arise?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I mean, I'm sure anyone who works in marketing has gotten these questions. It's always about improving, right? Hey, sure, like great job last month. What have you done for me lately? It's one of those things like, you establish a 2x ROAS as a great benchmark. You hit that, cool. Well, now we want 3. Like it's a never-ending cycle of improvement, which is what's so fun about this. But at the end of the day, like Sarah, I mean, that's why we love Varos, because it allows us to see or to learn where to best prioritize our improvements. So for instance, we could be hitting a great ROAS, which is like that end metric, and we could be maybe in the top performers for our overarching, ROAS, but maybe that's because we're only targeting bottom of the funnel, and we're only doing that with like really strong offers. So we're like sacrificing our margin to hit that ROAS. Well, that's probably not the best case scenario. Like we'd probably prefer to be hitting that ROAS while maintaining our margins. So if we then reverse engineer and go backwards in that process and use those same benchmarks, we might find out through Varos that because we haven't been testing a lot of video content, that like our, hook rates or hold rates are way below industry standard because we're not targeting that top of the funnel. So those are like the things that, again, fill in the gray area from like a business perspective that we find to be so impactful. And then that's what allows us to focus our efforts and our time. Because, I've worked in e-commerce for a decent amount of time now. Historically, if you're only using like ROAS as your North Star, you're not telling really the full story at that point.
Makes a ton of sense. And I think like the last question that I have before we can jump to the Q&A, everybody, so make sure to keep voting, all that good stuff, is just related to the next steps after this. So we've digested on how we will evaluate the actual creatives themselves. We've talked about how it's stored and kind of begun to be communicated around. I'm curious about the actual decision-making process that happens after you start to get this data back. So you've run the first 30 days, for example, for a specific brand's creative roadmap, and now you're at a place where you've learned. So how are those learnings applied? Are they into net new concepts? Are they into really granular changes like first 3-second and hook changes? What does that start to look like?
Yeah, and I would say, again, this relates back to one of the concepts I think about a lot, which is breadth versus depth, because you need both, but you need to do both very efficiently or as efficiently as possible. And exactly to your point, Evan, once you find that inkling that something is performing well for your brand and for your audience, that's when you want to start going depth. And then rather than, hey, we're testing frameworks, within the depth, you might have a winning framework, but now you want to start testing that opening hook. See if you can improve the thumb stop rate or the first 15-second hold rate. You want to start testing the value props within those maybe middle 5 to 10 to 15 seconds, and then evaluate that hold rate to see, hey, does value prop A, B, C combination work better, or is it D, E, F, right? And really like start to split test within that asset. So those are, again, then really diving, I'd say, deeper into the particular asset or the particular framework itself. And again, like the trigger for that is you start to see high performance from any of those like framework or asset type tests. That's when you want to start building a strategy to go deeper.
Cool. That's fantastic. Appreciate you, Max. Now I think it's a perfect chance for the last 15 minutes here to actually switch over to our Q&A. So everybody, get those into the Q&A tab. If you've thrown it into the chat, make sure to move it on over to the Q&A. I'm immediately breaking my own rules, so I apologize because I saw a question pop up earlier that I really liked. But Jacqueline had a question, and she had asked, Max, could you give an example of an offer that was inspired by the Facebook group for the client that you had spoken about in that example?
Yeah, that's a good one, because for this particular client, they have a super robust creative testing strategy, and it's a lot of top of the funnel stuff. And then because they've built this engaged community, they're able to really continue to nurture that top of the funnel traffic that comes in and tries their product within this community. So I mean, there's really, I guess, two types of offers that we've seen to work for that. They do test a variety of just like dollar off, percentage off, BOGO between different products at the top of the funnel. But I think one of the things that's really interesting about like analyzing that like group dynamic within the Facebook page is the desire for them to feel more connected to the brand. So for them, they've become advocates. They've become essentially not like public influencers, but like behind closed doors influencers, telling their friends, telling, their colleagues, really preaching about the product. So like at that kind of point, some sort of referral offer is typically the best case that we've seen to work. That's super long-winded to answer what was a pretty straightforward question.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it's a super interesting case for sure. So I guess we can just jump into these questions that everyone has so kindly been putting in the Q&A window and upvoting on. So one of the top upvoted questions was something that you said towards the start of the session, but when you say we know it works well for a competitor, how do you know that?
Yeah, that's a really good call out, because how do you know that? For us, this more so falls into what we consider part of our creative strategy or creative direction process that we go into, which is really looking at aspirational brands. And this typically is done through leveraging something like ads library, looking at things that are live. Typically, if you're looking at a big brand that does a lot of testing, for instance, we're working with a brand who really loves like oats overnight as like an aspirational brand. If you go into their ads library, you start to search through these things and really see like what's been running for the longest amount of time, you can assume those things are high performers, right? So like that's one of the aspects that we can dive into. Obviously, from like an industry perspective, we can use a tool like Varos to really benchmark that. And then I'd say finally, we also are huge fans of Foreplay, which like any, I'm sure, creative partner or creative employee is or maybe should be. So like for every sort of framework or piece of content that we could potentially produce, we have high performing assets saved based on that same kind of thought process within Foreplay as great inspiration.
Shout out to Zach and Foreplay. Always
Hey.
got to have them in a loop. In line with performance, something Pradeep asked here is, how can you decide what to create in month 2 in advance when you haven't yet received performance from month 1? And the real question that comes after is, can you articulate how you confidently strategize as you've shown in Milanote? So I think the question is mainly around, if you are presenting the entire 90 days, what are you actually showing to the client or internally post 30 days? So it actually makes sense in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, and again, I would reference this back to, again, the intention of the roadmap is to say, in even the best case scenario, there's a lot of tests that you can run creatively. The intention of the roadmap is to say, especially based on your budget, because we all know testing an asset for $1 isn't going to be actionable. So depending on your budget, there is a right amount of assets you can test per month. So that's baseline how we decide how many assets are we going to test per month as part of our roadmap. And then the roadmap says, again, based on some of the answers to the last questions, here's what's working well within your industry based on our data, based on our research. So we're confident that these could work well for you. So it's not, we know they're going to work, but to do our diligence as a testing partner, there are things we should test. Now, within that is the full iteration process. So once we figure out what does work, that's what's happening on the, I'd say, shorter creation cycle of optimization. So it's not that we know 90 days in advance everything that's going to work. We know 90 days in advance what we want to test based on data. And then within that is optimizing it based on your data or the real-time data that you get back. It's a great question, though.
Awesome. And so one question here was, how do you think about messaging versus framework when you're using that terminology? And then as part of that, do you rewrite copy in every conceptual direction, or do you keep some of those top performing headlines that are layered into frameworks?
It's a very good question. So I will admit the term framework is pretty ambiguous as a word that's become so popular within this process. But yeah, I mean, as it relates to messaging, I guess I'll kind of key in on that. Obviously, every brand is different, should be different in how they communicate with their customers. Now, obviously, based on the initial data and research, we can get pretty close to saying hey, this sort of message resonates the most. When you use this tone, it drives the best click-through rate, as maybe an example. So we can really get close, I think, to running those tests. But as it relates to rewriting copy and really staying true to that, and I'll answer this as an external partner because it does present some challenges. As an external partner, we don't always have full creative freedom because we're provided those brand guidelines. So we can't test very widely within messaging typically. But at the same time, I wouldn't necessarily recommend testing broadly within messaging. I think the more important thing is to figure out, based on your brand tone and brand voice, what structure works best first. And then I'd say messaging is more on that depth scale versus the initial breadth test.
Words
Yeah.
are hard. I think that's a perfect transition into Valeria's question, though. So really diving into that external partner and just management side of things. But how do you handle the marketing department that wants everything according to the branding guidelines? Small fonts, for example, when a different design works better in terms of performance. And then the last caveat is do you only talk about it only after you get data, or what does this look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, Valeria's hitting hitting the nail on the head of like one of, I think, the biggest battles within creative, which again is sometimes like brand versus performance, right? And there's well-documented success stories of e-commerce brands who have scaled specifically direct response advertising in an e-commerce perspective very successfully by allowing themselves to go off-brand within their direct response advertising, but staying very true to brand on the website, landing pages, things of that nature. For us, that would be a perfect sort of scenario. A little bit of creative freedom to run the test, to know that we'd be able to launch them so that we can gather data and learn. I would say specifically to your question, how do you handle that marketing department that wants everything according to brand? I would try to root as much of your creative strategy in data as possible to say, here's specifically why I want to test this. Provide an example through something like Foreplay that says, and here's exactly what it will look like. And I want it to look this way for a reason. I think that, as much as you can put into the upfront communication of why you want to test something is the only way to overcome that. And unfortunately, I think at times you'll still work with a marketing department or a CMO or a brand that says, I don't like it. And that's okay. That's gonna happen. I think as long as you are able to back up your recommendation, you have the best shot possible at getting that thing live in the ad account.
It's happened to the best of us.
It happens. It happens.
Absolutely. All right. Another question we have here. So what do you do when the creative and bounce rates are good? So they gave this example. AOV is good, but CVR is low at 1.5%. Even with a 7% ATC rate, abandoned cart rate is high at 38%. Where would you specifically focus in this case? So a lot of numbers there to kind of dig into, but if you have a take.
It's good. I'll try to address this like in order. I mean, the first kind of glaring thing here to me is conversion rate, right? And this goes a little beyond, I guess, like the conversation that we've had for the majority of this talk. But conversion rate is obviously one of the most important things to drive performance, period. So, I mean, looking at your website, really analyzing the customer journey, heat mapping that if possible, understanding where people bounce from, super important. But then also on top of that, because I noticed like bounce rates are good in this scenario, it could be the landing page, right? If you're sending a very specific ad to just your general website experience, they might explore a little bit, they might not bounce, but they might not buy because you've triggered them to be ready to take action. And now there's a little bit more information for them to consume. So having that very conversion focused landing page is definitely something that plays a role in our process as well when in a scenario like this. As far as abandoned cart, I mean, we work very closely with a variety of great like life cycle marketing partners, diving into email, SMS. I mean, SMS is an incredible way to recover like abandoned cart revenue in my experience. But then also looking at like, what does your cart experience look like? There's great partners out there. Like Rebuy is one of our favorites for cross sells and upsells and free, buy a little bit more, get free shipping sorts of like, entertainment within the cart. So those are all things I would maybe look into.
And then the final thing I'll tack on there too, it depends what AOV being good means, right? Mm-hmm. Like you could have a super high AOV ultimately. And if that's the case, conversion rate, it's going to be lower in general anyways, but a lot of the tactics to regain who was in your cart, like that's where it comes even more into play rather than getting them on that first visit to your website ultimately. So I think all of it coming together tells that story. And I think we have time for one more question here. So the last one just comes from Ben. Ben asks, how many separate new ad formats do you recommend testing per 90 days, barring in mind that we are also doing creative iterations at the same time?
Yeah. So This is something we use internally, and I'm happy to share it honestly on the screen.
Awesome.
Evan, if you want to kind of dive in here, this is a rudimentary example of something we use for all of our clients, which is it's built on the premise that depending on your budget, there's a set amount of assets that you should responsibly test to enable them to ideally get through the learning phase within Meta or other platforms as efficiently as possible. So we use this internally. It's our creative calculator is what we call that, as you can see, and very aptly named, I suppose. But it's all dependent on your monthly budget, how much of your money you dedicate to like new creative tests. So this would be for you to determine because you are doing iterations, things of that nature, and then what your CPA is, so that based on a certain number of engagements, like how quickly that ad's gonna optimize. So this is dynamic, obviously. Like if we have clients that have let's just play around with it, $25,000 budget, they want to dedicate, let's just say 50% to creative testing. This would give you the number of ad concepts. And then within a number of concepts, we typically recommend having, we call them testing assets. So you'd have like 3 different versions of that concept to test. And that's how this is built. And you can see how that scales then with budget, etc. That probably doesn't help answer the question though, because he's probably like, that is great for you. Maybe not so great for me. I would say, and I'll just give you an average then. So like the average amount that we're testing on any given month is probably somewhere between, for one brand, I'd say 2 to 5 concepts. So then that would be 6 to 15 total new assets being added to the account each month. And we've seen that to be a healthy amount. That's probably more helpful. I probably should have started there.
And I think that's the best way to put a bow on this entire presentation, Q&A, all this good stuff, is you've tackled it from the high level all the way to the granular inspiration and example. So Max, Sarah and I are super, super grateful. Thank you so much for joining us on this one. And all of everybody who's tuning in live, really appreciate your eyes and ears. Means the world to us.